Melissa Hughes thought she knew her husband, Daniel, a quiet biology teacher with a calm demeanor and a stable life. But when Melissa discovered a hidden journal buried in their basement, she uncovered a truth so dark it cost her everything. Daniel wasn't just hiding secrets, he was hiding a past life, a missing woman, and a name erased from public record. To protect the life he built on lies, Daniel did the unthinkable, and for 12 years, no one knew. Daniel Hughes seemed like the kind of man who had everything under control. To neighbors and coworkers, he was quiet, polite, and predictable. He taught biology at Jefferson High School in Albany, New York, where he kept a low profile. He didn't go out of his way to befriend other teachers, but he wasn't unfriendly either. His students described him as serious but fair, a man who never raised his voice and always showed up 5 minutes early. His colleagues thought of him as someone who preferred to be left alone. It was easy to assume he simply liked his peace and privacy. At home, things were similar. Daniel lived in a neat 2-story home in a quiet suburban neighborhood with his wife, Melissa, and their daughter Sophie. Melissa worked part-time at the local library and spent most of her time caring for Sophie, who was in 3rd grade. From the outside, the Hughes family looked happy. Their lawn was perfectly trimmed, their house freshly painted, and their golden retriever, Max, always lounged lazily on the front porch. No one ever suspected anything was wrong. But Melissa's sister, Natalie, had long sensed something off. Melissa rarely talked about her marriage in detail. She'd often brush off questions or change the subject when asked about Daniel. It wasn't that she seemed unhappy, it was more like she was constantly trying to convince herself that everything was fine. Natalie had noticed how Melissa had slowly lost touch with her old friends, how she stopped attending family events unless Daniel came too. She always had an excuse, usually something to do with Sophie or work. Then came the day everything changed. On June 3, 2022, Melissa was supposed to pick up Sophie from school, but she never showed up. At first, no one panicked. Daniel claimed she had driven to the mountains to get some air and clear her mind. He told the school that he'd pick Sophie up instead. When Melissa still hadn't returned by nightfall, her sister began to worry. Natalie called Daniel, who calmly said Melissa had probably just needed time to herself. The next day, Melissa's car was found near a remote hiking trail 2 hours north of Albany. It was locked, her phone and purse were still on the passenger seat. Nothing inside seemed disturbed. It looked like she had stepped out for a walk and simply vanished. Search teams combed the area for days. Drones, dogs, and volunteers joined the effort. But no footprints, clothing, or personal items were found. It was as if Melissa had disappeared into thin air. At the time, Daniel didn't act the way people expected. He didn't join the search. He didn't speak to the media. He didn't post online asking for help. He stayed home. Neighbors noticed he spent most of his time indoors with the blinds drawn. When asked why he wasn't out helping, he said he was too busy taking care of Sophie. He looked more annoyed than heartbroken. Still, the police had no concrete evidence of foul play. Without a body or a witness, there was little they could do. Natalie refused to accept the idea that Melissa had simply walked away. She began digging into Melissa's personal life, talking to friends and coworkers. That's when she found something strange. A friend of Melissa's mentioned that a week before she disappeared, Melissa had seemed anxious. She had asked odd questions about wills, identity documents, and court records. She also asked how to search for sealed files in another state. Natalie brought this information to the police, who agreed it was worth looking into. Investigators began retracing Melissa's final days. Her internet history showed multiple searches for a name Andrew Carter. There were also searches for name changes in New York and criminal records Ohio. None of it made sense until they realized that Andrew Carter was not a stranger. He was Daniel Hughes, or rather, who Daniel used to be. This revelation changed everything. Police dug into Daniel's past and discovered he had legally changed his name in 2011, shortly after moving to Albany. His records before that point were limited. One sealed court case showed up in Ohio from 2010, but the details were hidden under legal protections. He had clearly gone to great lengths to bury his past. Now the pieces were starting to fit together. Daniel's behavior became more suspicious under scrutiny. Investigators reviewed footage from traffic and gas station cameras. One image showed Daniel near the hiking trail where Melissa's car had been found just hours before the police arrived. He had claimed he hadn't been near the area at all. His phone data told a different story. Cell tower pings placed him in that very region the night Melissa disappeared. Still, without a body or a confession, there was no arrest. Weeks passed. The public began to lose interest. But Natalie didn't. She kept pushing, digging, connecting threads. She couldn't let go of the feeling that Melissa had discovered something serious, and that her discovery had cost her life. The truth, as it would soon be revealed, had been buried not just in lies, but in the earth itself. And Daniel had been hiding it for over a decade. When Melissa vanished, the initial wave of concern had quickly shifted into something darker. As days passed without any trace of her, the police began treating her case not as a missing person, but as a potential homicide. Melissa wasn't the kind of person to disappear without a word. She was a dedicated mother, careful planner, and known for her cautious nature. The more investigators learned about her routines and personality, the more convinced they became that something had gone very wrong. The discovery of Melissa's internet search history had cracked open a door that Daniel Hughes had worked hard to keep sealed. Investigators now knew that Melissa had been researching the name Andrew Carter in the days before she vanished. That name had no apparent connection to her until police dug deeper and uncovered the truth about her husband. Daniel Hughes was not who he claimed to be. He had once been Andrew Carter, a man with a sealed legal case and a completely different life. This revelation shifted the entire direction of the investigation. The sealed court case from 2010, buried in the records of a small Ohio county, was nearly impossible to access. But the detectives assigned to Melissa's case managed to obtain a limited summary. It referred to a domestic dispute, but the details were redacted. The only name associated with the case besides Daniel's was Emily Carter, his ex-girlfriend. She had gone missing in late 2010, shortly before Daniel legally changed his identity and left Ohio for good. Her case, never solved, had gone cold due to lack of evidence and public interest. The connection between Melissa's disappearance and Daniel's past grew stronger. Still, police needed more than coincidence. They re-interviewed Daniel, who was growing increasingly guarded. He refused to discuss his previous identity and insisted that Melissa had left on her own. He described their marriage as normal, peaceful, and claimed Melissa had been emotionally unstable in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. He couldn't explain the searches she had made, nor the inconsistencies in his alibi. Daniel's behavior raised more red flags. He declined to take a polygraph test. He stopped cooperating altogether. He also withdrew large amounts of cash from multiple bank accounts, leading police to believe he might be planning to flee. Authorities responded by placing him under surveillance. Unmarked vehicles followed him discreetly. His movements were tracked. His internet use was monitored. Meanwhile, Melissa's sister Natalie was still chasing answers. She continued speaking with anyone who had known Melissa in her final weeks. One person, a co-worker at the library, came forward with a startling story. She said Melissa had come to work one day shaken and pale. She had mentioned finding an old journal hidden behind boxes in their basement storage room. Melissa hadn't said what was in it, but she looked terrified. That was just 3 days before she disappeared. This new lead led police to secure a search warrant for the Hughes home. The search was meticulous. Every room was examined, every drawer opened. The basement was the final area explored. At first it looked ordinary, but one detective noticed that the shelving along the far wall seemed newer than the rest of the room. After carefully removing the wooden boards, a hollow space was revealed behind the wall. Inside, they found a metal trunk, sealed tightly with rusted latches. It was heavy, and the air inside smelled of mildew and something else. Inside the trunk were personal items, photographs, old letters, and a journal. It was filled with pages written in the voice of someone named Emily. The final entry was haunting. Emily wrote that she feared her boyfriend Andrew was watching her every move. She said she had discovered something about him that made her want to leave immediately. The entry ended abruptly, and there were dark stains on the pages that looked like water damage, but may have been something else. The items in the trunk had clearly been kept for years. There was no reason for Daniel to have them unless he had known Emily well. Police now had a tangible link between Daniel and a woman who had gone missing under suspicious circumstances. And now, another woman linked to him had vanished? The evidence was mounting, but Melissa was still missing. Investigators began to re-examine the area where her car had been found. A new search was organized, this time expanding beyond the trailhead. Cadaver dogs were brought in and fanned out across the nearby forest. After several hours, one of the dogs alerted near a patch of disturbed earth in a clearing less than a mile from the trail. The ground was soft, the grass oddly sparse. Careful excavation began the next morning. Just beneath the surface, a layer of tarp and plastic sheeting was uncovered. Beneath it lay the decomposing body of a woman, later confirmed through dental records to be Melissa Hughes. She had been buried in a shallow grave. There were signs she had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. Her wedding ring was still on her finger. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. What had once been seen as a tragic disappearance was now a confirmed murder. The husband, who had shown little emotion, had a sealed past and a hidden identity. The puzzle pieces were aligning in the worst possible way. But the question remained, why had Daniel killed Melissa? What had she discovered that made him believe murder was his only option? The answer, investigators believed, was buried not just in the woods, but deep in Daniel's past, under the name he thought he had left behind. The discovery of Melissa's body changed everything. What had started as a missing persons case was now a full-fledged homicide investigation. The once quiet home of Daniel Hughes became the epicenter of a disturbing mystery that reached back more than a decade. With Melissa confirmed dead and buried in a remote forest, the focus turned entirely to her husband. The journal found in the basement trunk had already raised serious suspicions. Now, with a body in the ground and a pattern beginning to emerge, police began to connect the final dots that would unravel Daniel's double life. Investigators revisited the basement, this time with forensic experts. The hollow space behind the wall, where the metal trunk had been found, appeared to have been constructed deliberately. It wasn't part of the home's original structure. Someone had gone to great lengths to conceal it. The trunk itself was full of strange items: an old driver's license belonging to Emily Carter, a tattered sweatshirt, a broken phone with no SIM card, and several envelopes filled with notes, receipts, and photographs. One photo showed a younger Daniel than Andrew smiling with a woman who was later identified as Emily. They were standing in front of a small house in Ohio, arm in arm, both appearing happy. That photo had been taken in 2010, the same year Emily disappeared. It was clear that Daniel had kept reminders of his past hidden in the most literal way. But why keep the evidence at all? Why hold on to a journal that could expose everything? Investigators theorized that the journal was not originally meant to be hidden. Melissa had likely found it by accident and realized its significance. Her internet searches just days before her disappearance now made sense. She had discovered the truth that Daniel had once been Andrew Carter and that his ex-girlfriend had vanished under suspicious circumstances. Piecing together Emily Carter's story became crucial. Though her case had gone cold years ago, detectives reopened it, hoping that new forensic techniques might yield better results. They contacted Emily's surviving relatives and learned she had been in a troubled relationship with Andrew before she disappeared. According to her sister, Emily had complained about feeling trapped. She had confided that Andrew was controlling and that she had begun looking for a way out. Her last contact with family had been a cryptic voicemail in November 2010, saying she was leaving town and might not be reachable for a while. That was the last anyone heard from her. Not long after, Andrew Carter vanished as well. He legally changed his name in New York, moved across state lines, and began his life over as Daniel Hughes. There were no police charges against him at the time. With no body and no concrete evidence, the case quietly faded away. But now, with Melissa's murder, authorities saw the pattern: two women who got too close to Daniel's secrets, and both silenced. Back in Albany, forensic teams began a full scan of the Hughes property. Using ground-penetrating radar, they searched the backyard, particularly near the shed and the garden, which Daniel had been known to spend a lot of time maintaining. During one scan, a small but abnormal area beneath the garden bed drew attention. When the soil was removed, authorities discovered a bundle wrapped in black plastic and duct tape. Inside were more personal effects items belonging to Emily Carter: a necklace she was known to wear, a notebook with partial writings, and a driver's license cut into pieces. Though no human remains were found in the yard, the presence of Emily's belongings was enough to draw a solid link between the two cases. It was now almost certain that Daniel had killed Emily in Ohio and disposed of her body in a location yet to be found. Then he moved to Albany, began anew, and when his past caught up to him, he murdered again. Digital forensics added another layer of evidence. Police recovered deleted files from Daniel's laptop and hard drives. One file, a scanned document, appeared to be an old lease agreement for the Ohio home he had shared with Emily. Another was a typed letter never printed that read like a confession. In it, Daniel spoke vaguely about losing control, about needing to protect his future, and about people not understanding the choices he made. It didn't name anyone directly, but the tone was disturbing and desperate. Daniel was arrested at his home 2 days after Melissa's body was found. He offered no resistance and said nothing as he was handcuffed and placed into the back of a patrol car. Sophie, his daughter, had been staying with Melissa's sister and was thankfully spared from witnessing the arrest. The media swarmed the neighborhood. What had once seemed like a model family home was now a crime scene surrounded by yellow tape and news vans. The community was left stunned. People who had known Daniel as a mild-mannered teacher struggled to reconcile that image with the reality now unfolding. Parents of his former students were horrified. Some remembered thinking there was something distant about him, something cold. Others insisted they had never seen any sign he was capable of violence. The truth, however, was undeniable. Daniel Hughes had constructed a carefully controlled life around lies and silence, and when that life began to crack, he had responded with murder. His secrets had lasted 12 years, buried under a false name and a charming exterior. But in the end, they couldn't stay hidden. What Melissa found in that basement had led her to the truth, and it had cost her everything. After Daniel Hughes was arrested, the facade he had spent over a decade building collapsed entirely. The man once seen as a mild-mannered teacher, loyal husband, and quiet neighbor was now at the center of a deeply disturbing double life. The courtroom quickly became a place where layers of deception were peeled back one by one, revealing a history of manipulation, control, and violence that stretched back years. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that Melissa S. murder wasn't an isolated act of rage. It was the final act in a long pattern of calculated behavior. Following the arrest, Daniel's fingerprints were reprocessed through national databases. For the first time in over a decade, the prints linked back to his old identity, Andrew Carter, bringing Emily Carter's missing persons case to national attention. Though her body had never been found, the items buried in Daniel's backyard and the journal hidden in his basement were powerful pieces of circumstantial evidence. Detectives in Ohio reclassified Emily's case from a disappearance to a presumed homicide. The timeline now told a chilling story. In late 2010, Emily vanished. Within weeks, Andrew Carter legally changed his name, left Ohio, and settled hundreds of miles away under the new identity of Daniel Hughes. In Albany, Daniel wasted no time rebuilding his life. By the end of 2011, he had secured a job at Jefferson High School. A year later, he met Melissa at a community event hosted by the school library. To Melissa, Daniel was thoughtful, intelligent, and refreshingly low-key. He didn't like talking about his past, saying only that it was complicated and better left behind. She respected that. They married quietly, and not long after, Sophie was born. Daniel now had the one thing he had always wanted: control over his life and how others perceived him. It was that control he fought to protect, no matter the cost. Prosecutors carefully reconstructed the weeks leading up to Melissa's death. According to digital forensics, Melissa had spent hours online researching not just the name Andrew Carter, but also how to uncover sealed legal records and what steps were involved in reporting suspected identity fraud. She had also downloaded files about how to search for missing persons across state lines. In private, she had been trying to connect the pieces of Daniel's past. When she found the trunk in the basement and read Emily's journal, she realized her husband wasn't just hiding a previous relationship, he was hiding something much worse. The journal entries revealed a haunting story. Emily had grown afraid of Andrew in the final months before her disappearance. She wrote of him checking her emails, following her to work, and gaslighting her into thinking she was paranoid. She also hinted that she had discovered something that made her want to leave immediately. The final entries read like a warning. She planned to leave the house while Andrew was away, but she never got the chance. Her last entry was dated just 2 days before she disappeared forever. Daniel must have recognized the signs when Melissa started acting differently. She grew quiet around him, made more frequent visits to her sister, and began locking her phone. It was likely that Melissa had intended to confront him, possibly even to go to the police. Daniel, sensing the danger to his carefully crafted life, took preemptive action. Investigators believed he waited until Sophie was staying overnight at her aunt's house before confronting Melissa. Something happened that night, likely a heated argument sparked by the journal. Melissa may have threatened to leave or expose him. Daniel responded the same way he had years before, with silence, violence, and a plan to disappear the evidence. The level of planning that followed was chilling. He drove Melissa's car 2 hours north to an isolated trail, carefully staged the scene, and returned home with no signs of struggle or injury. He resumed life as usual, even continuing to go to work and care for Sophie. The only thing he hadn't accounted for was Melissa's sister. Natalie refused to believe the official narrative and forced the case to stay alive when it might have otherwise gone cold. She spoke to Melissa's friends, scoured her online accounts, and eventually gave investigators the key to unlock the truth. Melissa had been afraid, and she had found something. The court proceedings took nearly a year to prepare. Daniel was charged with first-degree murder in Melissa S.'s case and remained the primary suspect in Emily's presumed homicide. His legal team attempted to argue that Melissa S.'s death had been accidental or that she had threatened him first, but the evidence was too overwhelming. Forensic soil samples from the shovel in his garage matched the dirt from the burial site. Surveillance footage placed him in the area. Phone records showed his GPS location precisely near the trail where the body was found. Every alibi he offered collapsed under scrutiny. Throughout the trial, Daniel showed little emotion. He refused to testify in his own defense. He kept his eyes lowered when the prosecution displayed photos of Melissa S.'s grave and read excerpts from Emily S.'s journal. His silence, once seen as a sign of composure, now felt like something far more sinister. The prosecution's closing argument left no room for doubt. This was not a man who lost control in a moment of passion. This was a man who had carefully removed every piece of his old life, buried it under a new identity, and was willing to kill again to keep it hidden. Melissa had uncovered the truth, and for that, she had paid with her life. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. Daniel Hughes was found guilty of murder in the first degree and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A separate grand jury in Ohio later indicted him for the suspected murder of Emily Carter. While her body was never found, her voice captured in the pages of her journal was finally heard. For 12 years, Daniel had managed to live 2 lives. But in the end, no secret stays buried forever. The sentencing of Daniel Hughes brought a sense of relief to many, but for those closest to Melissa and Emily, justice felt incomplete. Daniel had been found guilty, sentenced to life in prison without parole, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Yet the truth behind the lives he destroyed still carried weight that a courtroom decision couldn't lift. Families were left grieving, communities were left stunned, and a small girl was left without her mother. Though the case was officially closed, the emotional aftermath was just beginning. Melissa's sister Natalie became the family's voice in the months that followed. She took custody of Sophie and worked hard to shield her from the media storm that never seemed to stop. Though Sophie was young, she had begun to ask difficult questions. Natalie, determined to be honest while protecting her niece's innocence, explained things slowly. She spoke about Melissa as a hero, someone who had uncovered a terrible truth and tried to make it right. Melissa wasn't just a victim in Natalie's eyes. She was someone who had fought, even when she didn't know what she was up against. Across state lines in Ohio, Emily Carter's family finally had a sense of direction. Her parents had waited 12 long years without answers, tormented by the silence that followed their daughter's disappearance. With Daniel now charged in her case as well, they felt that Emily's story was no longer forgotten. Though her body was never recovered, the evidence in Melissa's case brought to light what had likely happened to her. Emily's journal had given her a voice that couldn't be ignored. In court, her sister read portions of the journal aloud, a moment that left the courtroom in stunned silence. Every word painted a picture of fear, control, and isolation, echoes of what Melissa must have experienced too. Daniel never confessed to either crime. He maintained his silence through every hearing, showing no remorse or explanation. Psychologists who observed him described him as emotionally detached and manipulative, someone who thrived on control and feared exposure more than consequences. The calculated way he buried evidence changed his identity and built a new life pointed to a man who had thought through every detail except for the moment when it would all come crashing down. The home Daniel once shared with Melissa was eventually sold at auction. No one in the neighborhood wanted to live there, and it remained empty for nearly a year. The once manicured lawn grew wild, the paint peeled, and the house stood as a hollow shell of a life that had never truly existed. Some suggested tearing it down, saying it carried too much pain. Others wanted it preserved as a reminder of the hidden dangers that can exist behind closed doors. Local schools added programs focused on relationship warning signs, emotional abuse, and identity safety. Melissa's case became part of statewide training for law enforcement, especially in how to investigate sealed pasts and spot patterns across jurisdictions. Her story wasn't just a tragedy, it became a turning point in how missing persons cases were handled. What began as a quiet domestic incident eventually spurred change in both policy and awareness. Natalie also started a foundation in Melissa's name, dedicated to helping women uncover background information about their partners safely and legally. The nonprofit offered free resources, access to investigative support, and a network for survivors of domestic abuse. The foundation's mission was simple: to prevent another Melissa, another Emily, from falling through the cracks. The launch of the organization was covered by national media, and Natalie's voice became a powerful tool in a growing movement. The final piece of the story, however, remained unresolved. Despite multiple searches, cadaver dogs, and forensic scans, Emily Carter's remains were never found. Daniel refused to speak, and without a direct confession, her parents were left without a place to grieve. They held a memorial service, placing an empty urn beside a framed photograph of Emily. Her mother stood before the crowd and thanked Melissa for uncovering the truth, calling her a sister to Emily in spirit. The grief was still raw, but it was now mixed with gratitude and recognition. Years later, Sophie would grow up with stories of who her mother was: brave, kind, and deeply loving. Though the details of her death were eventually shared with her in time, they were always balanced by memories of how Melissa had lived. Photos, videos, letters, and the people who loved her kept her memory alive in ways Daniel could never erase. Sophie learned that her mother had stood for truth, even in the face of danger, and that she had chosen to protect others no matter the cost. Daniel remained in prison, isolated from the world he once manipulated. Occasionally, journalists requested interviews, all of which he denied. He became a figure of study for criminologists and psychologists, trying to understand how someone could live a double life so convincingly. But in the end, he was just a man whose secrets, buried for 12 years, had been dragged into the light by those he thought he could silence. The legacy of the case lived on not through him, but through the voices that refused to be quiet, the families that refused to give up, and the truth that refused to stay buried.